The Chicago Bears are casting a wide net with the requests they're putting out for candidates to interview for head coach. And some of the names they're asking about right now have Bears fans panicking a little bit.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Right now, new customers who place a $5 bet will get started with $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On the show today, we look through the initial set of names the Bears have requested. Not necessarily all the names the Bears will request, but on Black Monday, they didn't waste any time getting to work, putting those requests out to other teams saying, hey, we'd like to talk to your coordinator, your head coach in one case, your former head coach in some other cases. And we'll kind of go through, okay, some of these names might scare you a little bit, but it's just a first round interview, mostly a Zoom call, asking about their ideas and stuff. And hey, we don't need to read too much into it or panic too much about such a wide list of names. It'll only matter when they really get down to the finalists who they're trying to decide between. So we'll look at some of the guys that they've already requested, some guys I think they should still request, guys who they could request by now but haven't requested yet, and there's some interesting names in there, and if there's any wild cards still to come in this mix as well. But it was kind of fast and furious on Monday, and then trickled in throughout the day all the different names that the Bears put requests in. And of course, this time of year is always dangerous for recording these podcasts because I'm recording this Monday night. It comes out first thing Tuesday morning, and midway through Tuesday morning, they could add another name or two to the list that we're not going to talk about here. But as of the end of Monday, the list I counted was 11, and that when you include Bears interim head coach Thomas Brown, who technically, isn't somebody they had to put a request in, but they have said they plan to interview him. But the Bears put in requests for both Lions coordinators, Ben Johnson on offense, Aaron Glenn on defense, request for Dolphins defensive coordinator Anthony Weaver, Cardinals offensive coordinator Drew Petzing, Giants offensive coordinator Mike Kafka, Vikings defensive coordinator Brian Flores, Steelers offensive coordinator Arthur Smith, Ravens OC Todd Monken, and then a couple of interesting names. They put in a request to speak with Mike McCarthy, who, at the time I'm recording this, has not been fired by the Dallas Cowboys, and also former Stanford head coach David Shaw, who's like kind of a assistant consultant type for the Denver Broncos right now, a senior personnel executive, so kind of more of a front office person in Denver. The Bears putting in a request to interview him. That list has some names that you like and some names that should scare you a little bit here, right? Like, there's no world where the Bears should hire Giants offensive coordinator Mike Kafka to be their head coach right now. Like, there's just no reality where a guy who probably was going to get fired from the Giants, and probably Giants fans wish they had fired that whole coaching staff. Like, the offensive coordinator from that staff is not going to just jump over to the Bears and become the head coach here. They absolutely should not hire Pittsburgh Steelers offensive coordinator Arthur Smith, who, was the head coach of the Titans for a while and wasn't doing, or he was the offensive coordinator for the Titans, I should say, head coach for the Atlanta Falcons, and both of those fan bases were not super thrilled with the job Arthur Smith did. And even now in Pittsburgh, the offense is kind of hitting some walls again and going back and forth between quarterbacks. So it's like, oh no, the Bears are interviewing Arthur Smith and Mike Kafka, and Drew Petzing doesn't do a great job with the Cardinals offense. A lot of Cardinals fans don't like him there. Mike McCarthy, the Cowboys may still fire Mike McCarthy. Oh geez, why are the Bears interviewing some of these, I was going to say objectively bad candidates. That's a little harsh, right? But these candidates that are not nearly up to the quality of some of the other names on the list, like Ben Johnson or Aaron Glenn, that likely will both end up becoming head coaches during this head coaching cycle because they're two of the most desirable candidates out there. Why bother interviewing some of these guys? Are they seriously considering Mike Kafka and Arthur Smith? And I think the answer there is like, are they seriously considering them? Probably not. I mean, they're considering them enough to give them an interview, but this is so much more of a sort of a fact-finding and information-gathering process here. You interview these guys because they're going to come to you and say, here's my idea for Caleb Williams. Here's how I will run the offense with Caleb Williams. Here's what I would like to do with your offensive line. Here's how I think I should use your receivers and your tight end and your running backs. And here's who I would build my staff with. Here are the coaches I think are really smart and I would like to have on my coaching staff. So that then if I'm Ryan Poles and Kevin Warren conducting these interviews, I can compile all of that information from all these different candidates, even the candidates I'm not really that serious about hiring. And you can look at it and say, oh, you know what? Actually, these 4 candidates all recommended the same offensive line coach. And oh, maybe that's a pretty good sign that this is a pretty good offensive line coach, or these 3 candidates were all talking about this defensive coordinator in some really good light. Like, he must be a good candidate. Or, these 6 offensive coaches all saw it the same way with Caleb Williams. They all thought Caleb Williams should be doing X, Y, or Z. And like these, and they can be sort of a means of getting different ideas and different perspectives on your football team, your roster, your players than what you had with guys currently in the building or guys who just left the building from the previous coaching staff. Like, there's no real disadvantage to interviewing this many people, right? This is not the stage of the process, as far as I'm aware, where you're flying them out to Chicago and taking them around the facility and have them meet everybody. Like, for coaches like Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn, like, they're still coaching with the Detroit Lions in the playoffs. And Brian Flores, you can't even actually interview him yet. You can put in a request to interview him, but they can't interview him until he's eliminated from the playoffs. So there's a few other coaches we'll talk about in that vein too. Like, most of this is get them on a Zoom call, talk over some of their ideas to see if you would want to advance to a more formal interview in the second round. But this is sort of just an initial fact-finding gathering, and there's not much downside other than, like, okay, is it wasting some of Ryan Poles' time to interview Drew Petzing or Mike Kafka? I mean, maybe, but if you can gain some valuable information from guys who might have different perspectives on things, there's something to be gained there. And if it's sitting on a Zoom call for a couple hours, I think it's worth the effort there. I think the fear is that, okay, the Bears interview these guys and all of a sudden, they get a little ahead of themselves or get cute and all of a sudden, wait a minute, actually, we really like what Mike Kafka is telling us here. And oh no, maybe we should, maybe they talk themselves into hiring somebody that they wouldn't have otherwise really considered seriously hiring because you gave them the chance to. I understand the fear, and I certainly don't think the Bears have any earned benefit of the doubt that they won't find a way to screw this up. But at the same time, this happens in every head coaching cycle. A lot of teams will interview a lot of different coaches, and then you settle on 3 or 4 and really hone in on those guys. And those are the ones we can start to bite our nails about and fret about, oh no, like, did they pick the right finalists here? And which of those finalists should we really be excited about? Whereas this is just like, okay, there's 10, 11 guys now. There's probably going to be, I would say, at least 3 more added to this list. You're going to go from, say, 14 guys to 4. So 10 of these guys aren't going to matter. And so let's not waste too much time thinking all of these guys are going to matter when only a handful of them will, especially because, like, really the top 2 on this list that matter are Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn, right? Like, those were like the 2 first names that came out that the Bears put some interest in. But there's another name. There's a couple names we haven't seen yet on this list, some that are still stuck in the playoffs and some that aren't in the playoffs and could be requested, but kind of surprised we made it all the way through Monday with no interview request put in for a couple of other guys here. We'll look at some of the other options here and also some of the top options still lingering on this list next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by PrizePicks, the better way to play daily fantasy sports. It's playoff time, and if you're like me, you want to make the most of these final weeks of football action, and that's where PrizePicks comes in, because it's the best chance to win real money while watching the games. You can turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. With PrizePicks, you simply pick more or less on player stats like total passing yards or rushing touchdowns for a shot to win up to $1,000. 1,000 times your money. You can make your picks in less than 60 seconds, and it just gives you a little something in these playoffs. Okay, there's no Bears out there, but you want to have a little extra reason to watch, a little extra reason to tune in, whether it's Jared Goff's passing yards or Saquon Barkley's touchdowns, whatever it is. It's a lot of fun and super easy to use, and there's really fast payouts as well when you start winning. So we got a special offer for Locked On Bears listeners. Download the PrizePicks app today and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Whether that lineup hits or not, you're getting $50 instantly with that promo code LOCKEDONNFL at PrizePicks. Run your game. The Bears put out, we said 11 interviews when you count Thomas Brown as sort of, it's not really a request for your own coach, but we've got 11 names that we have seen concrete, for sure, reporting that the Bears are planning to interview and have gone so far as to make the request to interview. There have been other names where it's like Chicago Bears are, quote unquote, expected to interview, say like Cliff Kingsbury. The Chicago Bears are expected to have interest in Cliff Kingsbury. But as of Monday night, the Bears had not formally issued an interview request for Cliff Kingsbury. So he's not yet on the list. He could still come on the list. They could decide not to interview him at all, but they are, just because they are expected to, doesn't necessarily mean they will file that formal interview request. And again, some of this stuff could come out Tuesday and make this a little bit dated, so I apologize for that in advance. But like, the name that jumps out to me that you would think they would put the interview request in for right away on Monday, that they did not. And that there's no playoffs getting them in the way of requesting, and this coach is already doing other interviews with other teams and getting some serious interest. So you'd think, if I'm the Chicago Bears and I'm interested in this coach, I would go out of my way to get an interview scheduled with this person. It's Mike Vrabel. We haven't had any official formal reporting on that happening because technically, his contract with the Cleveland Browns has expired, so I don't know that the Bears have to file a formal interview request with him. I think they can just schedule one. And again, we've seen reporting that the Bears are, quote unquote, expected to interview Mike Vrabel. I think there's even been language that the Bears are, quote unquote, planning to interview Mike Vrabel. But like, until we get the full, complete, yes, Bears have scheduled an interview. Bears are interviewing, not planning to interview, but Chicago Bears are interviewing Mike Vrabel. I am counting that as he's not on the list yet. He is not yet on the list. You would have to think the Bears have done homework on Mike Vrabel, have done extensive research on him, and are planning on reaching out, if not having already reached out. I mean, I think part of this is that it's harder for the insiders to report on a coach getting reached out to when he's not a member of a football organization already. Okay, when the Bears file their request with the Lions, there's like kind of a record of that, and there's now two sides. The Lions can put it out there, the Bears can put it out there, Ben Johnson can put it out there. I guess there's three sides at that point. When it's Mike Vrabel, when he's no longer Cleveland Brown, it's just the Bears call Vrabel or his agent, and so then if the Bears don't leak it, if Vrabel doesn't leak it, and the agent doesn't leak it, then no one ends up finding out that the Bears have been in contact with Mike Vrabel in this hypothetical here. The problem is Mike Vrabel has already interviewed with the New York Jets, and the connections are really going stronger and stronger with the New England Patriots. Pretty much everyone seems to believe that that's partially why they fired Gerard Mayo in New England, so that because they could clear the way for someone like Mike Vrabel to go there. That being said, like, if I'm Mike Vrabel and I'm already planning on, like, yeah, I want to be the Patriots coach. They fired their coach. Like, that's already the plan. Like, why not interview with the Bears? Like, why not have that as a backup plan? Because you never know. You might get into that interview with the Patriots thinking, oh, I can't wait to be the head coach here. This is my dream job or whatever. And then you're interviewing with Elliot Wolf, who's running the show over there. Or you hear from Robert Kraft in the interview, and you're like, oh, whoa, wait a minute. Like, they are not ready for me to be their head coach for whatever reason, whether it's a organizational dysfunction or restructuring or whatever it is. Like, you never know until you get the job and the ink is dry on the contract that you're going to be the head coach there, or that you're going to want to be the head coach there. I mean, I think it's partially why he took the Jets interview. I think he partially took the Jets interview to show the Patriots, like, hey, I have interest in other teams, but then, like, why not take a Bears interview? And again, they very well likely still will do a Mike Vrabel interview. It's just interesting that, like, we talked about some of the other names. The Bears were quick to get an interview with former Stanford head coach David Shaw. We're quick to put in a request there. First day you could get him. First day you could get Giants offensive coordinator Mike Kafka comes out. But Mike Vrabel doesn't get like day one interview request treatment there. That's the interesting aspect of it to me. Like, again, part of the message here today is like, don't read too much into everything and don't take, it didn't happen on the first day or it did happen on the first day, so that must mean X, Y, or Z. It's just something I want to keep an eye on moving forward. Like, if they never interview Vrabel, that'll be something we'll talk about for a while, right? Like, we'll look back on it years later and go, man, should the Bears have interviewed Mike Vrabel there, depending on what Vrabel does and where he goes and what kind of success or failure he has with his next team. It feels like the kind of thing that could fit in the category of, Jim Harbaugh last year, or, back to the Bruce Arians decision in 2013 or whatever. Like, we have a long running list of mistakes the Bears made along the way during a head coaching search that we knew at the time felt like a mistake. It wasn't hindsight to look back and say, man, the Bears should have hired Jim Harbaugh. Plenty of us were saying it last year. It wasn't hindsight to say, man, the Bears should have hired, I just said his name, Bruce Arians instead of Mark Trestman in 2013. Plenty of us were saying it back then. And not to say that Mike Vrabel is for sure the best choice for the Bears right now, but they should at least interview him, right? Like, that's something that we can all be like, hey, that's worth an interview here. Someone who's a lot different culture-wise than what the Bears have. But everyone's going to wonder because George McCaskey doesn't like people who swear, doesn't like curse words, doesn't like that kind of rough and tumble type of coach that Vrabel is. Like, the Bears leave themselves a lot of room for speculation by not, because of, okay, is this a McCaskey thing or whatever? But this is Ryan Poles' search. This is Kevin Warren's search. It's not, it's supposed to not be McCaskey, but we're always left wondering a little bit here. Instead, I think what we need to focus on is that sights are set on Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn. Right away, those are two of the first candidates that came out. Bears are requesting to interview those guys. Those guys have a first-round bye, so the Bears are able to interview them this week virtually over Zoom before their playoff, it doesn't have to be Zoom, but you know what I mean, remotely, before their playoff run is over. But that's going to be the challenge here, because say you have a good Zoom interview with Ben Johnson or Aaron Glenn, pick your flavor, and you're like, wow, we really like this coach, we want to hire him. Okay, well, Lions have a bye week this week, and then they'll play in the divisional round, and if they win that game, they'll play in the conference championship, and if the Lions go to the Super Bowl, you won't be able to hire that coordinator candidate until February. And if it's the right coach, you'll wait for him for sure, but you got to be certain he's the right coach there, because he's going to be coming in a little bit later than a lot of the other first-year head coaches. I mean, the Senior Bowl, for example, like when you go down and scout college players in Mobile, Alabama, that happens before the Super Bowl. Like, most teams send their head coach down there and their whole coaching staff down there to scout the college football players there. But Super Bowl goes on February 9th, Sunday, February 9th. Senior Bowl is a full week before that. If you're waiting to hire one of the coaches that's in the Super Bowl, you will not have a coaching staff in place to start your NFL draft process early. You'll be playing from behind a little bit. You'll have, I think, like 3 weeks until the NFL Combine. From the moment you hire that head, from the moment the Super Bowl happens to the Combine is like 3 weeks. Like, I'm not saying that's a good enough. I'm not saying you shouldn't hire Ben Johnson if he's in the Super Bowl because you're going to start late, but it is a consideration here. Like, I think at the very least, we have to be rooting for the Lions to lose. If you want one of those Lions coordinators, you want to see their playoff run end sooner rather than later, so the Bears can get on with this process. But there's a few other coaches in the playoffs that the Bears either are already interested in or are quote unquote expected to be interested in this process that I think are going to add to this interview list. And before we even start to make finalists out of the list that does exist, the current first round list is still incomplete. So we'll look at some of the other lists, the other names the Bears haven't requested interviews with yet that we should expect might be on that short list next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by Gametime. I love going to live events, whether it's sports, Bears games and basketball games, or music, concerts, theater shows, comedy. I mean, I love going to concerts. I went to almost 25 concerts this past year, and most of my concert tickets I got in the secondary market with the Gametime app on my phone. I love it. I love the live experience, whether it's for a sports game where you can actually see the players, hear the hits, see everything happen in live action and not have timeouts, or not have commercials, I should say, or it's the concert where you can feel the music in addition to seeing and hearing it. I mean, it's an unbeatable experience, and that's what Gametime helps bring to you every single day. With Gametime, you can see the view from your seat before you buy your tickets, so you know exactly what you're going to get with your ticket purchase, and you can turn on all-in pricing so you get the total cost up front and no surprise fees at checkout. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem that code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. The Bears already have a long list of coaches they've put in requests to interview, and I fully expect that list to get longer. Maybe as soon as today, coming out on this podcast on Tuesday, but if not now, in the near future, because a lot of the coaches they're interested in are still, or the coaches they should still be interested in at least, are still in the playoffs. I mean, generally you would think if you're hiring a new coach, you would like him to be from a team that is successful and winning, and therefore a team that is in the playoffs. That doesn't mean there aren't good coaches on non-playoff teams, but it sort of would make sense that the top coaching candidates wouldn't be available to be interviewed and hired right away because they're top coaching candidates because they're in the playoffs. Whereas like a lot of the names on the Bears list right now, think about Dolphins defensive coordinator, Cardinals offensive coordinator, Giants offensive coordinator, Steelers offensive coordinator, Cowboys head coach. Those are all coaches not in the playoffs. And it's also like, coincidentally, like those are also pretty much the least desirable coaches on this list. I mean, you can throw in David Shaw, I guess, because he hasn't coached in 6 years, 5-6 years, whatever it's been. But like the coaches you might like the most on here: Ben Johnson, Aaron Glenn, Brian Flores, Todd Monken, all coaching playoff teams. And it's interesting because the Bears put in requests for Flores and Monken. They don't have first-round buys, so the Bears cannot interview those guys until they're eliminated, but they at least put those requests in right away to get the ball rolling there now that they're allowed to put in the requests there. Johnson and Glenn, they can because it's a first-round buy. Technically, because the Kansas City Chiefs have a first-round buy, the Bears could, in theory, interview, Matt Nagy or Steve Spagnuolo or Dave Tobe would be an interesting name to talk about at some point, but alas, they cannot. But it's interesting to me that the Bears put in requests for two playoff coaches, Flores and Todd Monken, but none of the other playoff coaches on the first day on Monday. And again, I'm really trying to emphasize here, it was just one day. You can only put in so many interview requests in one day, and maybe there were just more names. The Bears didn't get all reported in one day, all the different names the Bears are going to go after. And by the end of Tuesday, we'll have a full list of 15 guys, the Bears, and there was nothing to hem and haw about. But so far, like, we fully expect the Chicago Bears will also like to speak to at least Tampa Bay Buccaneers offensive coordinator Liam Cohen, who has done a really good job with Baker Mayfield there this season. And he's also a Sean McVay guy dating back to the Rams. He was their offensive coordinator for 1 year, then went to Kentucky as an offensive coordinator for a year, and then back to the Buccaneers as an offensive coordinator for 1 year. I believe, if I remember correctly, the Bears interviewed Liam Cohen to be their offensive coordinator this year when they opted for Shane Waldron. They also interviewed Thomas Brown, you may remember. They also interviewed Cliff Kingsbury, as you may remember, and probably got the worst out of all those candidates. Nonetheless, he's a guy they have some familiarity with, so perhaps they may want to bring him in again for a head coaching interview, or perhaps they saw everything they needed in their first OC interview and said, not really the guy for us. Same thing could be true for Cliff Kingsbury, or they could still decide to talk to Kingsbury again. But they did interview Kingsbury for the OC job. They have a sense of what his plan was going to be for Caleb Williams, just like they do with Liam Cohen. And maybe that was enough. Maybe because they didn't like him enough to hire him as the OC, that Ryan Poles doesn't think they're going to like him enough to make him the head coach just 12 months later. So why bother interviewing them again? That's perhaps reasonable, but a couple names don't fit in that category. The main one is Joe Brady, the Buffalo Bills offensive coordinator. Another name that's fully expected, quote unquote, to be a part of this process here. He was promoted to interim offensive coordinator last year for them after being their quarterbacks coach, and then has been the full offensive coordinator this year. Josh Allen's had another great year, et cetera, et cetera. And prior to that, he was the Panthers offensive coordinator for 2 years before Thomas Brown in 2020 and 2021. So he's been around the block a little bit, but he's done a really great job this year and was the LSU offensive coordinator or passing game coordinator when they won a national championship back in 2019. I think that was the Joe Burrow year, if I'm not Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase year. So like, he's been around some good offenses. He's in the playoffs. A little surprised the Bears haven't put in a request for him, but maybe they still will. Maybe that won't be the end of the world here. One other name to keep an eye on that I'm not necessarily like endorsing here, but he's already generating some interest, is Denver Broncos defensive coordinator Vance Joseph. He was formerly a Denver Broncos head coach. You may remember, has some experience. He's another name that's a playoff coordinator that other teams are interested in that I would expect the Bears to have some sort of interest in here. I mean, just because you're already interviewing all these other guys, you're interviewing the Giants offensive coordinator, you might as well talk to the Broncos defensive coordinator if everyone else is. Like, why not? Add him to the list there and see what information he can provide you and what you can learn from interviewing somebody like Vance Joseph here. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. The one guy on this list who the Bears can be stopped from interviewing is Mike McCarthy, the Dallas Cowboys head coach. You may be thinking to yourself, like, Mike McCarthy is the Cowboys head coach. How can you request to interview another team's head coach? Quick explanation there. Mike McCarthy's current contract as head coach of the Dallas Cowboys expired at the end of this season. So he is about to enter free agency as a head coach. That means the Cowboys could still re-sign him and bring him back as their head coach. The Cowboys could opt to go a different direction here. Because of the way this process works, when his contract expires, the Cowboys have an exclusive negotiating window where for the next, I don't know the exact date, the next week or two, Mike McCarthy is not yet a free agent. His contract has expired, but he can only negotiate a new contract with the Dallas Cowboys for the next couple of weeks here. But because the Bears asked permission, the Cowboys could grant him permission, and Jerry Jones has come out and said he would grant Mike McCarthy permission to interview somewhere else and said something along the lines of, we want people who want to be here. So if they want to interview somewhere else, I'll let them, but we want you to be here. And if you don't want to be here, that's fine. We'll let you go, but we only want you if you want to be here. So go interview if you want to leave, but otherwise, certainly a nice way of covering his tail if he wants to fire Mike McCarthy and then blame Mike McCarthy for taking interviews elsewhere. I will again reiterate, I don't think the Bears should hire Mike McCarthy. I think that would be a bad hire. Not the worst hire in the world, but a bad hire nonetheless. Like, it's not the worst name on this list, but not a name that would inspire anything. I mean, when you look at like this exact list, the guys they have actually requested so far, I think in no particular order, your top names are Ben Johnson, Aaron Glenn, Brian Flores, Todd Monken. Like, those are the four favorite there. Probably in that order, if I'm being honest with you, but I was just kind of going top to bottom on my list there. And really no one else on that list do I have any legitimate interest in hiring. I don't want Anthony Weaver. I don't want Drew Petzing. I don't want Mike Kafka. I definitely don't want Arthur Smith. I don't want Mike McCarthy. I don't think I want David Shaw. It's worth talking to those guys. It's worth getting their ideas. But like, out of that list, Johnson, Glenn, Flores, Monken are clearly at least one tier ahead of everyone else. And we can parse out those four that I mentioned, but like anyone but those four feel like it would be fairly disastrous. And even among those four, I've got different levels of confidence and quality in them, but like those guys all feel like clearly head and shoulders above everyone else on that list. Then you can throw in somebody like Joe Brady and Mike Vrabel up in that higher tier. I don't think Cliff Kingsbury or Vance Joseph would be that way for me. Liam Cohen's kind of on the fence for me there as well. I don't know if I'd love making him your head coach, but that's why they're doing the interview process and we're just on the outside looking at coach resumes and trying to get a sense of who might be the best fit for this Bears team. You can be sure in the coming days and weeks here on the podcast, we're going to break down individual head coaching candidates. We're going to get to know these guys better and give you a better sense of who you think the Bears should or shouldn't hire throughout this process. We're your number one stop for all of your Bears head coaching search updates here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you're looking for a second listen today, check out Locked On NFL. I joined Tyler Rowland for this morning's Locked On NFL podcast. We talked about the Jaguars firing Doug Peterson, but not Trent Baalke. We talked about the Bengals firing their defensive coordinator. We talked about one other coordinator firing, and I'm forgetting off the top of my head. But then we also, it was the Seahawks offensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb. Then we talked about the Giants not firing their coach. We talked about somebody else. We talked about so many different coaches. We talked about the Giants retaining their coaching staff and another team retaining their coaching staff. And then we jumped to like, will the Raiders fire Antonio Pierce? Will the Cowboys fire Mike McCarthy? All the Black Monday news you need on the Locked On NFL podcast. Comes out twice a day, once in the morning with Tyler Rowland. In the afternoon, it's the barber Tony Wiggins in the barbershop. It's a great show covering the NFL for your second listen. Come on back and make Locked On Bears your first listen again tomorrow for another opportunity to bear down.